thanks for taking the time to chat.
No, thank you. Honestly, thank you so much for the time here. Out in the Ring is a fascinating doc. I really appreciate it. I grew up on pro wrestling, so I was really excited about this conversation too, and because there's so much to discuss and unpack in what you've done. So, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did. I did. I was. Let's just get into it. I got a number
Go
of
for
questions.
it.
I was wondering what I growing up as I did. As I said, I grew up on WWE, to a lesser extent WCW, and I this interesting conversation between wrestling and sexuality, even just in the way that they dress. Like I remember seeing Shawn Michaels come out in the ring, and there's this documentary does a really interesting job of tying that in, um, to the gay community. And I was just so interested in that. What is it about professional wrestling that opens the door for this sort of flamboyance? Isn't quite the word, or is it? I'm not quite sure if that's the word
I
to
think
use.
flamboyance is the word. Um, as I think as Scott McEwen says it best, so many of these the straight identifying professional wrestlers have what they call cognitive dissonance. They're not able to see what's in front of them. I mean, the fact that the Road Warriors dress in black leather and they don't know that that they don't realize that that's a fetish. That's fetish gear. That Shawn Michaels is essentially wearing white fetish gear in his ring attire. These are mostly, in a majority of cases, I mean, the majority of them are men in fairly skimpy clothing, whether it's spandex or, short tights. I mean, uh, rubbing up against each other. I mean, it's, in a way. I mean, not so much as, in that sense, but I mean, it's there. I mean, it's obvious that it's there. But but again, it's also easy to put that to compartmentalize that stuff. But there is both sides to this. I mean, there's a sexual component to it. It's clearly there because you're talking about, in a lot of cases, men like Shawn Michaels wrestling as the sexy boy. He's coming out to the music. He's provocatively dancing. He's doing all of these things. And again, on the other side of the coin, I mean, you've got wrestlers like Adrian Street and Adrian Adonis in the height of their career who were basically using that idea of fear of homosexuality and fear of gender representation, and to create kind of a discomfort, which is also playing on somebody's sexual discomfort around gay people. So it's a really fascinating world that you can't help really disconnect it when you look at the bare bones of it. I mean, it's rooted in a lot of the same cultures that drag and ball and all of those things are.
Yeah, which is fascinating because I mean we've seen it for decades, through the wrestling culture, even from Flair, and it's sort of embedded within that culture, with that culture within the sports entertainment aspect. But I'm so glad that you addressed this in the documentary because about I think you finally get to it about halfway through, because I was starting to think about characters like Gold Dust and Gorgeous George, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when we see more of these outlandish characters, a lot of times the way they find more success as heels, as opposed to face. And I was
Again,
wondering,
it's as we mentioned, there was a period of time where, as people, and this it still exists. I mean, discomfort with gay people, discomfort with trans people, non-binary representation, even lesbians. I mean, in wrestling, I mean, there are certain women who won't work with certain women, because I don't know what they're afraid of. I mean, as Dark Sheik puts it in the film, I mean, I don't have time to worry about having sex with you. I don't have time to worry about hitting on you when you're taking my life in your hands and throwing my body around. So there's this idea of around like, oh well, what if somebody hits on me, or what if somebody does this to me, and so because of that fear that comes from people's discomfort. I mean, you're able to use that kind of, able to use transphobia and sexuality and gender expression as villainry. And it goes back to the late 1940s and the 50s and 60s with Gorgeous George, and to a lesser extent, Pat Patterson's brief foray into Pretty Pat Patterson with the makeup and that. But the Gold Dust character, I mean, is ultra fascinating because it was something that he wasn't 100% comfortable with. It was his fellow wrestlers who said, listen, we really want to get people upset. Rub my chest, and touch my butt, or do that. And those things were, what they used for villainry. But it's got a history in wrestling. I mean, in the '60s, you had to sneak black wrestlers out of arenas in the trunks of cars because being African American was a villain. The Iron Sheik, I mean, you're talking about the ultimate xenophobia. Cold War politics with Nikolai Volkov and Boris Zukov, and we even tried it. They even did it again in the late '90s, 2000s with Hassan, the character Muhammad Hassan. They were going to try and put him into a feud with the Undertaker right around the time that 9/11 happened, and then that, obviously you couldn't do that anymore. But there's still attempts to play on this. I mean, presenting an Indian character with a turban in contemporary wrestling, in the case of what's been in the WWE the last few years, as somebody who is pompous and arrogant and rude. I mean, it again, it's a form of xenophobia. Oh, look at these arrogant, I hate to say it in this term, brown people is way some people would look at it. And look at these arrogant Indian people, how they do this. I mean, it's something that has, that still goes on, and gender and sexuality and transphobia and all of that are just part of this kind of idea of creating heat.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, wrestling has always done this, like you said, not just with sexuality, but the easiest stereotypes on a broad scale. I think, if I remember correctly, even around the time of 9/11 and WMDs, then of course,
Yeah.
who's evil? The French,
The
and
French, absolutely. They even, it's something so easy. I mean, and and at the time, the man who was writing those storylines for Rene Dupree and Sylvain Grenier was Pat Patterson, who had discovered Sylvain Grenier. And so he was in charge of that. Yeah, Sylvain Grenier got his spot because he met Pat Patterson in Montreal, and Pat, saw the look and the style and brought him in.
that is so interesting, especially with the relationship that he's had with stereotyping along the way.
Hmm.
Um, well, I mean, there's a fascinating comment that comes up towards the end of the film, and it talks about WWE using justice as marketing. And I think WWE is not alone in this. I think we could see that about any number of industries across the board using that, but specific to wrestling. There's a question that arises out of this: can WWE be trusted with LGBTQ content? And can they, with the emphasis on
In,
stereotyping and that? Do you,
in the
do you think
current in
they
the current zeitgeist, I don't think they can be.
can?
I mean, we're talking about a company here that philanthropy is the future of marketing, is her own tweet,
Mm.
and she's happy to weigh in there, and then they do things, they've done this over and over again. The Billy and Chuck storyline in the early 2000s was being embraced by everybody for being what appeared to be incredibly brave.
Right.
That they were putting these characters on there, and they went so far as to team with GLAAD, the Gay Lesbians Against Defamation, and GLAAD. They did an interview on the Today Show, which unfortunately has been scrubbed from both the NBC and WWE libraries, where they were on the where Billy and Chuck were on the Today Show, and GLAAD sent a congratulatory wedding gift in the form of a gravy boat to them on the air. 2 days later, they were like, we're not getting, they were doing the wedding, and we're not gay at all. We're not this. And, and the whole thing got called off. But they leaned into that heavy. So they've done this before. And they did it again in 2018, 2017, 2018 in New Orleans when Finn Balor created his Balor Club for Everyone, rainbow flags. 50% of the donations from those shirts was going to GLAAD. And then at the same time, we're talking about the fact that that same card had the only out active performer wrestling on the show in Sonya Deville, who had a rainbow flag on there, and they didn't even talk about her. But yet, as Billy says, you've got a cis white hetero dude wearing a rainbow flag with the gay community coming out, and then yet you've got an out woman on your roster who's wrestling, and you barely talk about her and acknowledge her. And then, we're talking about this philanthropy component. The same time they're talking about all this philanthropy and it's the future of marketing, and they're doing all this stuff with GLAAD and all these organizations and Be a Star, they're signing billion-dollar contracts with a country that would kill LGBTQ people in an instant in Saudi Arabia, and to this point has also banned certain performers from actively wrestling there. Sami Zayn cannot wrestle in Saudi Arabia because he's of Syrian descent. So he can't wrestle on those shows. Women have to wrestle covered from the neck to the bottom. This is, so can they be trusted? Well, clearly, they make the overtures, and they've certainly done things like hiring Jake Atlas at the time out of their their Undercover Boss show, but they had not, they didn't care about him, coming out of Undercover Boss. They didn't hire him until 2 years later. Stephanie asked to bring him in, and it was again just to try and make a point that, see, listen, we're not the bad guys here. And so, I don't know if they can be trusted. I think a company like AEW is better positioned to show that they can be trusted, because at least they've had at the top of their card the first transgender women's champion in Nyla Rose, and that Sunny Kiss is incredibly popular, not nearly on TV as much as Sunny Kiss should be, but that they're also actively using Anthony Bowens in positive spaces, and they've hired a lot of the LGBTQ plus talent that had been on the WWE roster and brought them in. People like Toni Storm, who've been very open about their bisexuality. And at this point right now, I mean, you've only got 2 or 3 out women on the roster. You've got Sonya Deville, you've got Dewdrop, and you have Shayna Baszler. But nobody's asking these people, to have that as part of their storyline, but one shouldn't have to hide who they are. In the character, and so that's kind of where I question whether they ever will have that plan until they sell the company. Until Vince is gone,
Yeah.
I don't think they will.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the case or not. I mean, I know you probably cannot answer this, but I've wondered if it's generational, whether it's Vince and Stephanie. I don't know, because Stephanie
Well,
taking over.
I think Steph has always grown up with it. I mean, her godfather was a gay man. I mean, and Pat Patterson, right? I mean, Vince's right hand for 40 years wasn't was a gay man. You know, he was out behind the scenes, or as Bertrand Hubert and other people have said better, hiding in plain sight. Which is why, but when you hide in plain sight like that, you also set yourself up to be the victim of a lot of accusatory behavior and sex scandals, as happened in the 90s. You can easily become a target. But the fact that after all those years Vince didn't learn anything from Pat, Stephanie clearly did, but she also is still they're still stuck in this very corporate world. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that they have a very conservative base as their investors. We're talking about a man who is, his wife was in the Trump administration and is still friends with the man, and still close friends. Stephanie has stepped away temporarily. It would appear it would have to do with family and health reasons with her husband, and he's back at work full time. But the question is how much control is going to be rested there, and whether that conservative, that space that Vince still kind of leans into, is still going to be prevalent.
This is great, though. This is a great conversation, because I mean, WWE. You look at the history. I did not realize that Glad was such a big supporter of the Billy and Chuck storyline. I did
Yeah,
not realize that. And it seems like whenever sexuality appears, and I mean overtly, and we're not
yeah,
talking about the dress anymore, we're talking about overtly, the emphasis is on beautiful women being together
yep.
or mocking masculine stereotypes.
Yeah,
And,
mocking femininity, mocking trans people, which has been done on camera. I mean, China, who I felt, Joni Lauer, who I felt completely terrible for. I mean, if you think about, here was a woman that was mocked and accused of being a transgender woman, and again, to her credit, obviously knows there's nothing wrong with being a transgender woman. They're a woman, but it does cause discomfort for somebody like Joni. And of course, my editor Brad Webb is a genius, and when he put together that segment on Joni Lauer that puts those photos, that feminization process, and he edited that together to work with what Pollo Del Mar was saying, is a beautiful idea of they wanted to make her into you're too masculine.
mm,
You need to that. And Howard Stern says it in that horrible way. He says, look at those man hands.
yeah.
And she was a classically trained pianist, but nobody would have ever known that because who took the time to find that out? And at the time that she was a victim of these transphobic taunts, they put her into a storyline with Mark Henry, which isn't in the film. It's just we couldn't find a way to fit it in. At that point, they put her in a storyline with Mark Henry where she has a transgender friend who performs oral sex, simulates performing oral sex on Mark Henry, and then she plays the video in the auditorium in front of Mark's mom, and he leaves the room and vomits at the concept of ever being with a trans woman.
Wow.
I mean,
Wow.
these storylines are, and then you've got HLA. I mean, the hot lesbian action angle. We found that clip. We were looking for the one where Eric Bischoff says these aren't just lesbians, they're bisexual lesbians. And Caitlin Diamond in my film was the one who mentioned that clip. And she said, I remember that clip as a bisexual woman because bisexual lesbians don't exist. You're a lesbian or you're bisexual.
Yeah.
So, and you would think at some point they'd learn. You'd like to think they'd learn, but they still don't because in 2008, when Orlando Jordan came in, and also you look at who was in charge there at that point, it was Eric Bischoff, Hulk Hogan, a lot of those people were there, and they had him come down as a polyamorous stalker from, with one man and one woman. And then he was, in a storyline with Eric Young where he's touching Eric's, he's lusting after Eric while he's his tag team partner, and Eric is oblivious to his sexual you know, stalking. It's a constant thing that they seem to fall back on when you're lazy. You go back to what you just go back to these storylines, and I mean, they did it again. I mean, the lesbian storyline with Lana and
Oh yes,
Rusev and Liv Morgan.
Yeah, Morgan.
Liv was that Lana was having an affair with a guy a guy and Liv Morgan, and that was a bad thing.
Mm,
And that was what it was presented of is like, oh my goodness, oh, not only is she cheating on her husband with a guy, she's cheating on her husband with a woman. How dare that happen? You
mm,
know, and they keep leaning back on it. They did it again with Liv Morgan and Rhea Ripley recently. They tried to infer that Rhea and Liv were lovers. And then they stopped that storyline, and there was a lot of positive feedback about are they really going to go down this route of potentially these two women being more than just friends? And they stopped that very quickly. They seem to always get to the point where they're just about to possibly present something as just what it is,
mm.
and then pulling it back. And I mean, it's certainly why I've been impressed with the way AEW has handled the characters that they've handled. But it's still, it's still there. I mean, I don't know if they'll ever really learn.
Well, it's interesting because as you say that too, the next question I have in my mind is I want to ask this well. but you say they just get there. You talk about Liv and Rhea, and then they pull back. Do you think there's a fear of portraying it negatively, like because you said they have got a very conservative base, or that somehow it will turn into something that they're not trying to portray, or do you think it's just that they're afraid
I
to
think
have
they're
those?
concerned. I think they're concerned to upset their conservative right wing, very white, very older male base. And I think this is where a lot of companies and politicians go. I mean, we're we're gonna appeal to our base that's got the money. We're gonna appeal to that, but we don't want to push too far. I mean, how far can they push with with Fox? Like, is Fox gonna let them go there? Um, they're clearly embarrassed by some of the things they've done because they've been actively going through the library at Peacock and then from the WWE network and scrubbing, you know, the blackface sequences that they've done in the past, the anti-trans stuff. Obviously, they for some good reason, some of the Chris Benoit stuff has been gone. Um, and that's a whole other story that's tough to deal with because do you scrub a man's legacy based on what we now know was severe head injury and what caused it. But in terms of getting rid of things, the one clip that is the most dubious that's gone missing is that Today Show clip, and that Today Show clip is gone for a few reasons. One, it's the Billy and Chuck angle that got pulled back. Again, getting right to the point where Billy and Chuck could have gone through with that wedding and they would have just been partners, and then eventually they could have just broken up. And it wouldn't have been a big deal because there wouldn't have to have been a divorce at that point because same sex marriage wasn't legal in the country, but it would have been just a commitment ceremony. So they could have easily gone all the way there, followed it through, and then if they wanted to split the team up at some point, then they could have split them up. Just I'm done with you, and there would have been no reason to do anything fancy or whatever. But they do this all the time, and they just get there. And then, of course, the other reason that clip with NBC is scrubbed is, of course, who's interviewing. And this is interesting. He didn't go on the show as Billy Gunn. He went on as Kip Sop by his real name and talked about how he wasn't against gay people, and Chuck Palumbo, same thing, because that's his real name. And they went on there and they got interviewed by Matt Lauer. So, of course, optics now not a good idea to have Matt Lauer interviewing somebody about anything involving. So that clip is, I'm hoping at some point we'll unearth it. But they do a good job of getting rid of clips of things inappropriately said. I mean, but everything lives forever on YouTube.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Well, I mean, Rye, just as we're running out of time here, just to wrap up, I was wondering. I mean, it's interesting because we've talked about the issues here, but at the same time, the film ends almost on a positive note, and you're listing all the members of the LGBTQ community in WWE as well. You mentioned, of course, Sonny's in the entire film. You've got Shayna. You're talking about Sonya. You mentioned Tegan. You just talked about a few other ones yourself.
You know,
Has it changed? Is it better?
I
Or
think it's I think it's better, and I do think it's better for outperformers. I don't think it's better at the top of the card yet. Obviously, WWE is still kind of the $1 million, the $1 billion corporation. But but what there is that there wasn't 4.5 years ago when I started the company, when I started the film, was a company like AEW,
right?
another $1 billion wrestling company that has a younger, seemingly more progressive owner who is genuinely a wrestling fan,
Mm.
and is interested and in providing these things. But for all of the progress we make, I think we see this just in general in life. For all the progress we make moving forward on things and being progressive thinkers, and even in spaces where progress amongst in the religious space where people are trying to make more positive movements to show that religion isn't this ultra right wing conservative, very demonizing space. And I think anybody with a brain who takes the time to just take a breath knows that that's not what religion is in general. But but a lot of this plays in. But every time we take steps forward in all of those spaces to try and make changes, evil kind of seems to rear its ugly head again. Whether it's in racism, in Buffalo recently, but also as quickly as last week, where the guy from one of the major wrestling organizations got drunk and high and started texting Tony Khan transphobic stuff about how Nyla Rose, how he embarrassed his company because he put a man as his women's champion. And to Nyla's credit, the exact comment was, how embarrassing is that? You put the strap on a man in your company in AEW in your women's division. Mm-hmm. And Nyla, who is funnier than anything in the world, just responded with a Beavis and Butthead hee and said, "You said strap on." And she just diffused it and didn't say more than that. Because Nyla didn't have to, because the moment everybody saw it, they just came to her defense and said, "How dare you talk to this woman who works her butt off in the ring, who has been the world champion twice, who is not only a trans woman, she's multiracial, she's indigenous." I mean, she has not flinched and has taken this. And Sunny has had to be a victim of this. People like Jim Cornette have said that Sunny looks like a drag queen at the Tropicana, and he doesn't understand Sunny's storyline. It's like, well, because what Sunny wears in the ring isn't Sunny's storyline. That's what Sunny wears outside of the ring most of the time. And I can say that as well as a dear friend of Sunny's, that when I spend time with Sunny, it's crop tops, booty shorts, and makeup and bling. And that's what Sunny wears in the ring, pretty much. With maybe the suit, except the suit's spandex in there. So it's better. There's more opportunities for people to make money at a higher level with a company like AEW and with New Japan, and it seems like now with Ring of Honor being bought by AEW. But there's also, you can make a living on the independents. I mean, I look at somebody like Effie, who has created his own brand. Has never worked for any of the major companies, has no interest in working for Vince, has no interest in working for Tony Khan, but is working 6 shows a week and selling merch and running a brand and making money on Twitch and creating content, podcasting, and pulling in, 6 figures. So, but again, it's how do you it's getting to that step, getting to that place where you can be an Effie. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to be Effie, and not all of these independent young wrestlers who are just coming up have had that opportunity. I mean, we've seen a few that have maybe moved on. Kid Bandit is a young transgender wrestler, and she's done fantastic in terms of building up 60,000 followers, and has only been in the ring a year and a half, and trained by Cody Rhodes and QT Marshall at the Nightmare Factory, and has been on TV. And is now one of the hot young rising stars on the independent circuit. So hopefully, but again, it's taking, not all these wrestlers, they have day jobs, most of them. And then Friday, Saturday, Sunday is 4 shows. Yeah. And there's even some that are like 15, 16 years old, like Nick Wayne and Billy Starks, who, pack up in their dad's car with their boyfriend who's a wrestler, and he's 18, and there's another 17-year-old, and they all get in the car and they go from Nashville to Memphis to wherever, and we'll wrestle 4 shows at a weekend while they're doing homework in the car. So it's getting better for the performers, but it's still always, there's always a chance that we can fall back. So we have to be very cautious about making sure that, we keep positive messages and positive representation moving forward, so that we don't regress.
Right. Absolutely. This is great. Honestly, Ry, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Out in the Ring is fabulous, and I really appreciate the chance to chat with you. This has been a great conversation.
It's been fantastic. Thanks so much, Steve.
All right, thanks. Have a great day.
Take care.